Hello and welcome back to the channel. We'll be doing a different YouTube channel to usual. We'll be doing feature history this time. This one I've never actually done before. I've only ever done one other video on Irish history, and someone recommended this. So, yep, the original video will also be in the link in the description, and please like and subscribe to them and myself if you do like this content. And yes, let's go on the video.
Me potato. Now, with all the Irish people having been disgusted and left, we can start.
Yeah, it probably would have been wise to get all the Irish people out of the way because there'll be a lot of controversy, because this is a highly controversial topic.
Hello and welcome to Feature History, featuring the impatiently awaited and source of much pester, the Troubles. A rather understated name for a 30-year-long period of sectarian violence at its finest.
And where 3,500 people were killed over a religious dispute.
It formed both the issues and the culture of our contemporary Northern Ireland, and as such a relevant topic today, you can expect many unwanted opinions in the comments. Enough about that though, we have 2 videos worth of controversy to get through here, and now. And later when the second part goes up. For the source of the Troubles, you can go all the way back to 1169,
yes,
the Norman conquest of Ireland. But for the sake of brevity, I'm going to try to rush to the 20th century. Irish leaders for many centuries would struggle politically with English kings, and this peaked with the Protestant Reformation that saw the majority of England turn Protestant with their monarchy, and the majority of Ireland remain Catholic. A rebellion
as you'd expect from a country which had no actual roots, well, had roots in the UK, but weren't as strongly attached to them as they are now.
The late 16th century saw new efforts to assimilate the Irish, by just replacing who the Irish were. Protestant English and Scottish were sent to Ireland to attempt to colonise the island, and saw success in the north, or as it is otherwise known by, Ulster. The following English Civil War and Glorious Revolution would see the Irish Catholics ally with the losing side.
Yes, which probably didn't help the fact of them trying to keep their religion, because, you know, you have to think that King Charles I was seen as being more Catholic. That's one of the reasons why they actually sided with him, and that's ultimately one of the reasons why they are divided.
To penal laws being placed on them by the Protestant English Parliament. During the Great French Wars, the French would provoke a Protestant-led rebellion for Irish independence, which caused the British government to claim Ireland as a core part of their kingdom and bring them under
1707, I think.
Further control. Concessions would be made with the Catholic Emancipation in 1829, but it did little to improve their position. The damage had been done, and many Catholics were still made to live on the poorer land. A turning point would be the decimation caused by the Irish potato famine in 1845.
Which I've already took a look at in one of my previous videos that will also be linked in the description.
1 million deaths exacerbated by British mismanagement caused the Irish to demand for an Irish parliament. Some demanded for full Irish independence, but
that, of course, wouldn't happen because, you know, the British were very protective of all their colonies.
Popular movement was that of Home Rule. It'd see a self-governed Ireland within the United Kingdom. Its bill would finally be passed in 1912, much to the scrutiny of the mostly Protestant Ulster loyalists in the north. It did, however, be placed on hold given the outbreak of the First World War. Some more radical Irishmen would come out against British rule in 1916, dubbed the Easter Rising.
Yes.
It did fail, but when the insurrectionists were executed by the government, the rebels would become martyrs. Their fringe movement turned to public outrage. 73 members of the Irish Republican Party, Sinn Féin, would be elected to the British Parliament in 1918, and would refuse to attend the Parliament in London, instead choosing to form an Irish Parliament in Dublin in 1919.
Yes, which caused quite a few problems and controversies because of that.
Its action would spark the War of the Independence that saw the Irish Republican Army brought together to fight for, well, an Irish Republic. The Anglo-Irish Treaty, drawn up in 1921, would see a partitioned Ireland, one to be split between the mostly Catholic nationalist South and the mostly Protestant loyalist North. However, there was
which is actually a weird way that they've divided it, but because of the amount of land that Northern Ireland gets compared to the Republic, because actually the Republic is actually more northern than Northern Ireland.
Catch, as there was a significant Catholic minority present in Northern Ireland. There was also a substantial amount of people generally not pleased with the treaty, refusing to recognise the compromised Irish Free State, and certainly refusing to recognise a British Northern Ireland. The stem of the IRA would break off as the anti-treaty IRA and fight in a civil war, only to be put down in 1923 and have the Free State be affirmed. These wars had caused a drift in Northern Ireland. The Protestant majority now suspected and occasionally feared the Catholic minority, who had grown to...
Yes, which also meant that, again, you have this divide, which will cause some sort of conflict in the future, which means that, once a divide happens, there will be a conflict. As we've seen with a lot of them, one of them being the US Civil War, the British Civil War, and so on. So, you have to think that a lot of these things will eventually boil over into violence. Anger boils over into violence.
See the Protestants as oppressive and tyrannical. Over the course of several decades, segregation became normalized between the two communities. In hiring, education, and housing, Protestants and Catholics rarely mixed. The anti-treaty IRA still existed, however dormant. It had begun to see an influx of Marxists, much to the annoyance of the older, more traditional members. In the early 60s, Northern Ireland became subject to a civil rights movement, set on highlighting the inequalities in the province. Staunch loyalists...
It's actually, so the civil rights was actually very similar to the US civil rights in what they were trying to get.
Feared it as an IRA front, a facade made to lead to a united Ireland. Civil rights protests began to lead to riots, as both partisan loyalists and the Royal Ulster Constabulary wished to crack down upon them. This led to a great number of Catholics rejecting the RUC's authority, attempting to create their own institutions, as seen in the self-declared autonomous area of Free Derry. Tensions had been rising steadily since 1966, and would climax in 69.
Yes.
A Protestant parade was set to move through a Catholic area of London.
If you actually recognise that song, that is actually a very famous song about that. It's actually a very famous song which a lot of people now use for this event.
Derry, or whatever you want to call it so you don't get mad. Protestants and Catholics would initially begin slinging any old crap at each other, leading to clashes. As the police moved in to crack down, battles erupted. This is known as the Battle of the Bogside. Hundreds of police and civilians were injured in the riots, and the officers of the constabulary would be pushed from the Bogside area. By the third day of rioting, things had become intense, and the Northern Irish Prime Minister requested British troops to relieve the officers. A battalion would intervene as a neutral force to separate the residents from the...
Wasn't really neutral, really, and a lot of what is now considered war crimes were committed by the NRA and the British forces in Ireland.
Police bring an end to the battle. With the news of the battle spreading quickly, agitated Irish nationalists began to break out in protest, and the Ulster Loyalists, fearing a total uprising, began to clash with nationalists, causing widespread violence across Northern Ireland.
And this is why it's still talked about to this day, because without this violence and hatred, we would not have the divide we have in places like Dublin, where places of it is walled off, where the Catholics and the Protestants are walled off from each other, so not to cause something like this to happen again.
With an overwhelmed and accusedly biased constabulary not of much help, the British Army would have some serious trouble maintaining law and order. The army had initially been welcomed as a neutral force into the Troubles. The nationalists and loyalists both believed the army was there to protect them from the other. As the violence continued, however, some nationalists began to believe too little was being done to quell the violence against them. The divide in the population was clear, but beneath the surface another divide had formed. In the IRA, the traditionalist Republicans broke away from the Marxist bunch due to the perceived unwillingness of their leaders to protect nationalist communities. This new provisional IRA would soon dwarf its paternal organisation. They had, though, inherited a crumbling support. Few wanted the help of a paramilitary gang. This changed when in the Battle of...
Yeah, the IRA was basically a gang, but that actually tried to help, but wasn't supported.
St. Matthews in 1970, the local IRA beat back an armed loyalist mob in a shootout, serving to guard a Catholic nationalist enclave. It was a significant propaganda victory for the organisation. The British Army looked to disarm this violence. It would enter the infamous Falls Road area
Yes.
of Belfast, a nationalist stronghold, to seize armed dumps.
Belfast, that's what I meant. I got my capitals wrong again.
They were thorough and harsh in their action, doing a significant disservice to their reputation. In the Falls Curfew, the army would come under harassment from both the IRA and angered residents, leading to the unfortunate death of 4 civilians.
Which probably is why the Troubles is known as such a bad time, because of the civilian deaths.
In August of 1971, the British Army and RUC would undertake Operation Demetrius, which sought to intern paramilitary members. However, their list held a strong nationalist bias, and the operation itself was subject to fumbles, leading to an upsurge in reactionary violence. Those interned reported torture. 2 IRA members were killed, 2 soldiers had also been killed, not to mention 20 civilians. It wasn't a good look, to say the least. With nationalist support of the army at an all-time low, and the hopes of defeating the IRA militarily dashed, the soldiers would be turned to local policing, checkpoint duty, and riot control. The unpopular policy of internment continued as well. Imprisonment without trial was seen as the only logistical way to deal
We've also seen as crime.
with the unrest. In January of 1972, both the army and the police were deployed to oversee an anti-internment march in Derry. British
So actually, the anti-internment march is very famous for how badly it went.
paratroopers were present, and they had been despised for their role in killing 11 people during Operation Demetrius. Small groups began to lob rocks at the paratroopers, provoking the paratroopers to open fire in return. The crowd would
And this is what is another bloody Sunday because of the massacre.
quickly
It was an absolute massacre. I think over 100 people died from just being shot randomly with no actual cause.
devolve into chaos. 28 people would be
Oh,
shot
28.
and 14 died. Given the circumstances of their deaths, the paratroopers were decried for their actions, and the British Army at large felt the ire of the nationalists, Catholics, and more. In what
And I think quite a few of them were arrested because this was a war crime.
would become known as Bloody
Even though technically it wasn't part of a war, but yeah.
Sunday, it had put a definite end to any idea of a honeymoon. Yes,
North Sea Link is
Dang
currently
it.
the longest HVDC cable in the world. This system helps reduce the
hello and welcome to the rest of the video. Featuring the rest of the video.
Okay, he's kind of funny.
The civil rights movement disappeared alongside any kind of moderate party, as many new volunteers flocked to join the IRA. 1972 would be the bloodiest year in the conflict, and the worst for the British Army since the Korean War.
Yeah, so the British Army was at this point seen not as a very good figure because of what had just happened, and as well because of the fact that they were having to quell a mildly internal force because, you know, the British still wanted Ireland at this point.
The IRA sought reprisal, and would respond with a series of 22 car bombings around Belfast,
Yes.
killing 9 people, soldiers, police, and civilians included. The army would react with 58 arrests and raids for bomb equipment, leading to 1 IRA death. Loyalist paramilitaries would begin to set up checkpoints to overwatch their streets and look out for IRA members, leading to more violence and deaths. Over the course of the unrest, many similar no-go areas had cropped up. They relied on the protection of their
They still exist. So if you go to Belfast, you can still see these, and it's horrific just how, because of 2 conflicting religions, this has all been caused, and it just means that it's strange how the same religion, just different parts of the religion, can cause so much grief.
paramilitaries and barricades and rejected civil authority. The government decided those had to go, deeming them as a catalyst of crime. Operation Motorman would involve 27,000 soldiers alongside armoured vehicles and even a tank. They'd storm the no-go areas and destroy barricades, taking them by force and fear. There were a couple of deaths, and after the operation, 3 more car bombs would be detonated. The IRA, however, did not claim them. The mission had seemed to have contained the insurgent behaviour, but it was in 1973 that those assumptions would be negated.
Yes.
An IRA bombing in London killed 1 and injured hundreds.
This was one of the worst things that happened in Great Britain itself, because you have to remember Great Britain is the actual island, and this is what really caused the British Army to ramp up their power on Ireland.
The suspects would be arrested and tried, but an attack so close to home shocked many in the government. The conflict, alongside a deteriorating domestic situation, saw Anglo-Irish relations damaged, specifically about the British Army's handling of events. The Sunningdale Agreement in 1974 looked to permit the Irish government an advisory role in Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland's parliament to be disbanded and
Yes.
reformed in attempts to have power shared equally between nationalists and loyalists. Many loyalists disapproved of this, seeing it as giving in to the IRA's terror tactics. Political and paramilitary
The
elements
IRA is still seen as a terrorist organisation, and you can be arrested for being affiliated with them alone.
came together in the Ulster Workers' Council strike in May 1974. Paramilitaries would make sure that the workers did not go to work, whether they wanted to or not, leading to Northern Ireland's industry being brought to a grinding halt. 34 people would be killed in the Republic of Ireland by Loyalist bombings, and by the time the strike finally ended, the agreement collapsed. The Loyalist paramilitaries
So actually now they were a very complex agreement, but basically these days they're two separate countries, which actually means that if they went to war, it wouldn't be a civil war, it would be an international war. And the fact that the Republic is in the EU and the Northern Ireland is not, it would create a lot of tension, seeing as they're both in NATO and one of them's in the EU. It will cause a lot of strife if they ever did go to war for the same reason.
had achieved a victory through terror. Somewhat later the same year, the IRA would target England again, bombing the cities of Guildford and Birmingham, killing 5 and 21. These bombings caused anti-Irish sentiment in the afflicted areas, Irish people being ostracised and their businesses targeted.
And even being killed at this point, they would have been killed for just being Irish.
Reprisal killings would also be suffered back in Northern Ireland, leading to the IRA deeming such attacks to be off limits. There would also be some serious abuses of power in England, as police arrested several Irish people that were forced into making false confessions, leading to
Yes.
17 people being wrongly incarcerated. Back-channel negotiations between the British government and Republican leadership would finally be able to barter an IRA ceasefire in late 1974. This, though, did not stop tit-for-tat sectarian killings between nationalists and loyalists. The division in Northern Irish society was stronger than ever, and hatred
And still exists and causes a lot of problems, as I've said many times before.
ruled many incidents. Through the course of the ceasefire, a few loyalists feared that the government may lose interest, abandon them, leading to them attempting to provoke the IRA into breaking the ceasefire, and the IRA ate it up. The ceasefire had all but collapsed in late 1975. In January 1976, members of the Loyalist Ulster Volunteer Force attacked 2 Catholic families, killing 6 in what had been a part of a larger series of attacks on Catholics.
Another thing that happened is I think the IRA drove a tank into a house, killing several people.
IRA would retaliate with the Kingsmill Massacre, where they halted a van and gunned down 10 Protestants, sparing the Catholic that rode with them.
Yes.
The massacre would be the climax of the tit-for-tat killings, causing the string of murders to halt for some while. By 1979, the British Army had become quite effective in handling the IRA, though this only caused the IRA to become increasingly observant and inventive. They'd execute an extensively planned out guerrilla attack on the army in the Warren Point ambush, bombing both a British convoy and the ensuing reinforcements.
Which caused, I think, over a dozen deaths, and meant that the British Army would not take kindly to this, and would retaliate.
Killing 18 soldiers, and not losing a single of their own. The army was forced to rework their methods, becoming increasingly reliant on helicopters instead. This change offered the IRA virtual control of the south of County Armagh, swiftly turning it into bandit country. One of the more significant consequences of the struggle between the army and paramilitaries was the influx of many new prisoners and its taxing effects on the justice system. Initially, paramilitary prisoners were given special category status, which treated them akin to POWs. However, after 1976, they'd been downgraded to being treated as usual criminals.
And technically, they weren't POWs, because yes, it was technically a war at this point, but it wasn't internationally classed as one, because the IRA was seen as a terrorist organisation instead. And yes, they were downgraded to regular prisoner status, but they were more treated like your average POW at the time. They weren't given many of the freedoms, many of the opportunities that standard prisoners at the time were given.
Their own clothes were taken and they would be given prison clothes. They refused in the blanket protest, wearing blankets instead of the provided garb. Later they would refuse to leave their cells, reporting abuses from the guards, and this would escalate to the dirty protest, as they smeared excrement across the walls of their cells. In 1980, a hunger strike would start in hopes of returning their special status. The strike was called off when it seemed the government would concede. The following year, though, the government had not, leading to a second hunger strike led by Bobby Sands. The Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, was firm in her stance that she would not offer concessions to those on strike. She would not acknowledge them as political prisoners, but only as criminals. While on strike,
of course, this is Margaret Thatcher, one of the most controversial Prime Ministers ever. Personally, I don't really like her that much, but, controversial topic I'm not getting into. I'm only going to deal with one controversial topic at a time.
Bobby Sands was able to win the position of MP in the British Parliament, and this gave hope to some that a settlement would be reached. Thatcher continued to refuse compromise. Sands would die on the 66th day of the hunger strike in May. In total, 10 strikers would die. It prompted riots and protests in Northern Ireland and beyond. The political wing of the IRA, Sinn Féin, would begin to receive Newgain's support, and the IRA itself saw a flux of volunteers, wishing to correct this perceived injustice. With the Irish Republican, Gerry Adams' direction in the aftermath of the hunger strike, Sinn Féin would enter the Northern Ireland Assembly for the first time.
Yes, they tried before, but this is the first time they would successfully do it.
Though still well behind in seats of the Ulster Unionist Party and even the staunchly loyalist Ian Paisley's Democratic Unionist Party, it sent a scary message to Thatcher. It discredited the British policy that the IRA acted with no support and had no place in politics. On a less than legal note, the IRA had placed the blame for the strikers' deaths solely at the feet of Thatcher herself, and saw the...
Which kind of wasn't true, seeing as they could have called off the hunger strikes, but then they wouldn't have... and a lot of this could have been avoided, but, people do as people do.
Need for revenge. In 1984, they'd bombed the Grand Hotel in Brighton in attempts to assassinate Thatcher and her parliament, killing 5 people, but not Thatcher. This attack would begin to start reflecting the IRA as less of a simple paramilitary in Northern Ireland, but instead as a highly dangerous terrorist organisation. Not to mention it wouldn't be too long before they began receiving some serious armament from, oddly enough, Gaddafi's Libya. 1985 would see the highly significant signing of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Thatcher, despite her own...
which I think is still mostly in place today. I know there's a treaty that was signed in 1991 and 1993, which is what is now still currently used, but I think some of this is in them.
Protest would agree with the Irish Prime Minister, Garret Fitzgerald, to see Ireland brought into an advisory role in Northern Ireland. This agreement was to see cross-border political, security and legal cooperation between the two countries promoted. Despite how good it may sound, it was opposed by both loyalists, seeing it as doing too much,
and Republicans seeing it's not doing enough.
Nationalists, seeing it as doing too little. These political concessions and attempts to strengthen constitutional politics was all done in attempts to undermine the IRA. But the Republicans' campaign of terror continued. Attacks occurred against isolated army and police barracks, significantly damaging morale of troops, who would only see recompense when they were able to turn the tables and ambush the IRA members in 1987. killing 8 of the men responsible for the attacks. Later the same year, during Remembrance Day, the IRA bombed a war memorial used for ceremony. They killed 12 people and injured dozens, many of them being simply old-age pensioners.
which was an absolutely horrific event.
This attack would shake the IRA to its core, as the backlash was immense. Loyalists would seek revenge in blood, of course, but Sinn Féin's vote would utterly collapse, not recovering for 14 years. The IRA, however, still continued its armed campaign against the British Army. In 1989, overrunning a well-fortified checkpoint and killing 2 soldiers. They'd also once again seek to attack the Prime Minister, this time being John Major. With the increasing reliance of their improvised mortars, they'd commence an attack on 10 Downing Street in February 1991.
And of course it didn't work because they were homemade bombs, which have a tendency for not working very well.
The rounds would miss, but the attack still startled the government. Alongside this campaign against the British Army and government, they'd also become tougher on loyalist paramilitaries, assassinating their members.
Yes.
They'd attempted bombing on their leadership in 1993, but only killed 1 loyalist alongside their own men and 8 civilians. The failed attack only provoked more Catholic killings by loyalist paramilitary. At this point, after 25 years of constant violence and fear, it seemed endless. But this did not stop efforts to put an end to it. A historic ceasefire would be called in 1994 to allow for negotiation.
It's been 25 years so far. This actual thing lasted 30, with 3,500 deaths in total. And a lot of these from massacres.
But by 1996, the IRA was seriously doubting any progress to be made. The British Conservative Party was reliant on loyalist votes, and any concessions to the IRA would be severely unpopular. The IRA would break the ceasefire in February with the bombings on Canary Wharf, killing 2 people, but more importantly to the government, causing
I
significant
think there is actually a memorial to that on Canary Wharf still.
financial damage. They sought to replicate attacks on the government's wallet, detonating 1,600 kilos of explosive in Manchester's centre, surprisingly killing no one, but causing much damage and the evacuation of 75,000 people. The bombing had an effect on their general election in 1997, leading to Tony Blair's Labour Party coming into power.
Actually, one of the last times that Labour has been elected.
A new government saw new talks, though of course not without complications. The negotiations would be threatened over a dispute to the loyalist Orange Order parade seeking to move through a nationalist area. The government would allow the parade to go on, causing the worst rioting since the riots caused by the hunger strike in 1981. In spite of that incident, negotiations held, leading to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998.
Yep.
Northern Ireland's government was shifted to focus on power sharing. The Royal Ulster Constabulary would be watched by an independent commission to check for bias, eventually leading to the RUC being rebranded to the Police Service of Northern Ireland and restructured. And if the day were to come that the majority of people in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland wished to unify, the British government would have it be done.
It's the same with Scotland. If the majority of people want to secede, then they can secede.
Alongside these important changes, paramilitary weaponry would be decommissioned and many prisoners released. After 30 years of torment and over 3,500 deaths, peace was now tangible. Of course, the Good Friday Agreement didn't just come about flawlessly. It was passed by referendum, with 94% approval in the Republic of Ireland, but only 71% in Northern Ireland. Some loyalists felt cheated, and so too did some nationalists. In August 1998, a splinter group of the IRA would bomb the town of Omagh, killing 29.
Technically, that is highly illegal.
However, it did not break peace. The provisional IRA for the most part would lay down its arms and disband. Despite on the face of it still being active, they are a shadow. The change that had so rapidly happened was really showcased in 2007, when a radically loyalist Ian Paisley
Yes.
held position as First Minister, with his Deputy First Minister, a former IRA member and the Sinn Féin leader, Martin McGuinness. McGuinness would also be awarded an audience and even attend banquet with the Queen. To have come to that, from being not too long ago an enemy of the state, well, it's a bit surprising. The peace and government of Northern Ireland is, however, fragile. Currently given dispute between the DPU and Sinn Féin, the government is vacant and a fair share of people are frustrated.
Yeah, the Northern Ireland government doesn't exist much anymore.
But it couldn't even begin to touch on what the people of Northern Ireland have seen before. Whilst there are still many people that pledge adamantly to being either loyalist or nationalist, Peace can be found, and sectarian violence is increasingly rarer as time goes on. The deaths and destruction of the conflict can never truly be amended. To this day, you still find the literal peace lines that separate
Yep.
communities from one another, though they are said to be taken down.
Which is what I said earlier. And children play on these.
And as time continues, these wounds can start to heal. The war has ended, and no one won it. Really, no one should have won. A political struggle does remain, however. Ireland is not united. And was that not the IRA's goal? Is that not the point of Sinn Féin? Have I just provoked a massive shitstorm in the comments?
Yes, you have.
You can find out the answer for all those on your own. Though, little hint, the last one is almost definitely a yes. I'd like to...
Anyway, that's the end of the video, so remember to like, subscribe and all that, and check out Feature History. Honestly, I've never watched any of their videos before, and they seem brilliant. Even if you want me to carry on doing History of Ireland, honestly, tell me, and I will. I love the history of Ireland. It's something I've never actually known much about before. I'm sorry if I've seemed biased in this video. It's just, I'm trying to stay as unbiased as possible, but that's quite hard to do anyway. But I'll see you in the next video, and bye.